Hi there, welcome to Jville Stories. Please subscribe to my channel and turn on the post notifications to get updated when interesting stories are uploaded. Thank you. Vivienne remembered the day she met Robert as if it had been painted in warm sunlight. It was the late summer of her 25th year, a season of possibilities. She had been attending a friend's wedding, all lace and laughter, when she noticed him across the dance floor. Tall, confident, and impeccably dressed, Robert stood out not just for his good looks, but for the way he carried himself, self-assured and at ease, as if the world naturally bent in his favor. Vivienne, shy by comparison, couldn't look away. When he approached her, his charm was immediate. "I'm not much of a dancer," he said with a disarming smile, "but I think I'd regret not asking you for a turn." Vivienne laughed, a little flustered, but placed her hand in his. That first dance was awkward and wonderful. Robert led with the assurance of someone used to getting things right, and Vivienne felt herself falling into his rhythm, both on the dance floor and, soon after in life. Their courtship was swift and intoxicating. Robert, already climbing the ladder of a promising career, seemed to offer a life Vivienne hadn't quite dared to dream about. He took her to elegant dinners and introduced her to colleagues who spoke of him with admiration. "You're Robert." They call him as though he belonged to her already. And in many ways he did. Vivienne, raised by a single mother who had worked tirelessly to make ends meet, was unused to such confidence. Love to her mother had been something practical, a fleeting luxury in a life that demanded survival. Yet here Robert was offering her more: romance, laughter, and plans for a life she could believe in. It wasn't just the grand gestures, though they were plenty. Robert could write her notes in the margins of newspapers, jokes scribbled beside headlines he knew would make her laugh. He remembered every small detail about her, her favorite cafe, the way she liked her tea, the stories she told about her childhood. He saw her, and Vivienne felt like the most precious thing in the world. When he proposed, kneeling on one knee beneath the two twinkling lights of their favorite restaurant, Vivienne didn't hesitate. She said yes through a smile and tears, imagining a life where their love would shield them from anything the world could throw their way. Their wedding was simple but beautiful, filled with friends and family who cheered them on with hopeful eyes. Vivienne wore her mother's pearls and felt a sense of pride as she walked down the aisle. She had done it. They had done it. Two people who had grown up with fractured families were now creating something whole. Afterward, their life felt like the start of a fairy tale. They moved into a modest but charming house, Vivienne painting the kitchen a cheerful yellow while Robert mapped out plans for their future. "A big family," he'd say, brushing a kiss across her forehead, "and a life we can be proud of." It felt perfect then, their love a bright, unshakable thing. Vivienne couldn't see the cracks forming in the foundation, the ones that would take years to surface. All she knew was that she loved Robert, and in those early years, that love seemed enough to build an entire world upon. She never imagined that one day that world would come crashing down. The early years of Vivienne and Robert's marriage were full of energy, laughter, and quiet triumphs. Their first home, a modest two-bedroom cottage on the outskirts of the city, was far from luxurious, but it was theirs. Vivienne adored it. Filling the house with bright curtains, second-hand furniture, she refurbished herself and framed photographs of the two of them, snapshots of their travels, their smiles frozen in moments of joy. Robert's career took off like a firework, each promotion lighting the sky a little brighter. He was a rising star in his field, charming colleagues, impressing clients, and bringing home stories of long lunches, high-stakes negotiations, and celebratory toasts. He spoke with excitement about the future. "Vivienne, we'll move into a bigger place soon, somewhere the kids will have room to run when they come along." Vivienne believed him. She saw how hard he worked, how passionately he chased success. It made her proud to be his wife. It wasn't long before their first child arrived, a boy, full of life and wonder. Robert had tears in his eyes the day he held his son for the first time. "He'll be stronger than us," he whispered to Vivienne as the baby slept in his arms. "He'll never have to struggle the way we did." Vivienne's heart swelled. She believed in the dream they were creating, the life they both deserved. Motherhood came naturally to Vivienne, though it tested her patience and energy. Sleepless nights, first steps, first words, she was there for it all. Robert was less present, often working late or away on business trips, but when he was home, he was doting and playful. Their son adored him, toddling after him like a shadow. When their daughter was born a few years later, Vivienne's joy multiplied. She marveled at her little family, two precious children, a husband with a brilliant career, and a home filled with love. They weren't wealthy yet, but the promise of success loomed close enough to touch. Vivienne, too, contributed. She had always been ambitious in her own quiet way, balancing part-time work with raising their children. She loved being a mother, but she also loved the independence that work gave her. It was a way of holding on to herself, a piece of her identity she refused to let fade into the background. Life moved forward with a steady rhythm. Robert climbed higher in his career, and Vivienne kept their home running smoothly. They upgraded to a larger house, complete with a garden for the children to play in. They took family holidays, not extravagant ones, but trips filled with long walks, ice cream, and simple pleasures. Yet even in those years, small signs began to creep into their marriage. Robert's absences grew longer. The work that had once filled him with excitement began to consume him entirely. Vivienne missed him, but she told herself it was temporary, just a part of life. In the evenings when he was home, he sometimes seemed distracted, his mind elsewhere, even as they sat side by side. "You work too hard," Vivienne would say softly, reaching for his hand across the table. "I'm doing it for us," he'd reply with a tired smile. "For the kids, for the future." Vivienne believed him because she wanted to. She believed in their shared dream, in the life they had built together. She didn't see the distance growing between them, subtle but steady, like a river slowly carving its way through stone. And so she held on to those years as tightly as she could, the laughter of her children in the garden, the quiet moments when Robert would kiss her on the forehead after a long day, the whispered promises of a future that seemed so close, so real. But beneath that facade of perfection, something fragile was beginning to break. And when it did, Vivienne's entire world would shatter. As the children grew older, the demands of life multiplied. School runs, parent-teacher meetings, after-school clubs, Vivienne handled it all with quiet determination. Robert's career soared to new heights, and with it came longer hours, more travel, and an ever-widening distance between them. At first, Vivienne dismissed the nagging feelings of loneliness as normal. "This is life," she told herself. "Marriage isn't about romance every day, it's about teamwork." And for a time they were a team. Robert would come home from a trip with gifts for the children, stories of faraway places, and praise for Vivienne's ability to keep everything running smoothly in his absence. "You're the rock of this family," he'd say, brushing a kiss across her cheek. Vivienne smiled at the words, but something about them felt hollow. It was the silences that spoke the loudest. The gaps in their conversations grew, filled instead with the hum of the television or the quiet clinking of dishes as Vivienne washed up after dinner. The nights when Robert would retreat to his study with a glass of whiskey became more frequent. "Work emails," he'd explain over his shoulder, his voice curt. Vivienne would nod, though her heart ached for the man who once brought her notes scribbled on newspapers and whispered dreams of the future. One evening, Vivienne sat alone in the living room, a mug of tea growing cold in her hands. The children were upstairs, their laughter echoing faintly through the walls. Robert had returned from another trip, dropping his suitcase by the door without so much as a hello. He had mumbled something about being tired before disappearing into his study. Vivienne stared at the doorway, waiting. Minutes passed, then an hour. The house was quiet again. Vivienne set her mug down, her chest tight with emotions she couldn't name. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. She longed for the days when Robert's absence was temporary, not a constant presence even when he was home. The decision to try counseling wasn't easy. Robert resisted at first. "Why do we need a stranger to fix our marriage?" he had scoffed. "We're fine, you're just stressed." Vivienne fought back tears. "I'm not fine, Robert. We're not fine." After weeks of arguments and persuasion, he reluctantly agreed. Their first session felt clinical, almost sterile. The counselor, a woman with kind eyes and a calm voice, sat across from them as they shared awkward silences and half-truths. Robert spoke first, his tone dismissive. "I don't know what Vivienne expects. I'm providing for this family. That's what matters, isn't it?" Vivienne looked down at her hands, her voice small. "I don't want just a provider. I want my husband back." The counselor nodded, gently probing deeper, but the session ended without progress. Robert seemed more frustrated than ever. On the way home, he muttered, "That was a waste of time." Vivienne bit her tongue, feeling defeated. In her heart, she believed counseling could work if only Robert would let it. But every session followed the same pattern: Robert deflecting, Vivienne pleading, and both of them leaving feeling worse than before. Vivienne poured herself into the children. Her son was now a teenager, tall and reserved like his father, while her daughter had grown into a spirited, opinionated young woman. They filled her days with purpose, their lives a distraction from the growing emptiness in her marriage. Work too became a refuge. Vivienne picked up more hours, quietly proud of her contributions to the family. When she was busy, she could ignore the silences at home, the late nights Robert spent away, the way their once shared bed now felt like a cold, empty space. Her friends noticed the change in her. "Are you all right, Viv?" one asked during a coffee catch-up. "You look so tired," Vivienne forced a smile. "Just a lot on my plate. The kids' work, you know how it is." The truth was harder to admit. She was lonely. Lonelier than she had ever been. Robert's absences became longer. The children began to notice. "Why is Dad always working?" her daughter asked one evening, her voice sharp with teenage skepticism. Vivienne tried to smooth it over. "Your father works hard for us. You should be proud of him." But her words rang hollow, even to herself. The breaking point came quietly, like the final gust of wind that topples a crumbling wall. Robert was made redundant. Vivienne found him sitting in his study, staring at the floor, the letter crumpled in his hands. For the first time in years, he looked small, vulnerable. "Robert," Vivienne whispered, stepping into the room. "What happened?" He didn't look up. "They let me go." Vivienne's heart ached for him. She reached for his hand, but he pulled away. "It's fine," he said sharply, rising to his feet. "I'll figure it out," but he didn't. In the weeks that followed, Robert unraveled. He was irritable and unpredictable, drinking more than before. Vivienne tried to support him, encouraging him to take time, to find something new. "We'll get through this," she reassured him. Robert scoffed. "We? You don't understand. I've lost everything." Vivienne didn't argue, but something in his words stung. "What about me? What about us?" She watched helplessly as Robert withdrew further, his behavior growing stranger by the day. Some nights he wouldn't come home at all. When he did, he reeked of alcohol and wore an expression she no longer recognized. The man she had married, the man she loved, was slipping away, and no matter how hard she tried, Vivienne couldn't hold on to him. Weeks turned into months, and Robert's redundancy cast a heavy shadow over their home. Where once he had been driven and confident, now he was bitter and aimless. He spent his days slouched in front of the television or scrolling through his phone, a drink often close at hand. Vivienne tried to pull him back into life, suggesting job applications, courses, and opportunities. "Why don't you try consulting?" she said one evening as they sat at the dinner table, Robert with his plate untouched, their children eating silently. He scoffed. "No one's looking for someone like me anymore, Vivienne." His words cut through her optimism like a knife. Robert's bitterness infected everything. The conversations they once shared had dwindled to monosyllables, and when Vivienne pressed, his tone was sharp and dismissive. "Can't you just let me breathe?" he snapped one night when she suggested he join her on a walk. "Breathe? Robert, you've been drowning for months," she replied, unable to contain the hurt in her voice. Her words hung between them like a wall. Robert said nothing, but his glare was enough to silence her. That night, he slept in the guest room for the first time. It wasn't long after that Vivienne's daughter confronted her. It happened on a dull Sunday afternoon when Vivienne was folding laundry in the bedroom. Her daughter walked in without knocking, her expression stormy. "Why do you keep pretending everything's fine, Mum?" Vivienne looked up, startled. "What are you talking about?" Her daughter's face flushed with anger. Dad's been cheating on you for years. Vivienne froze, her hands trembling as she let the sweater she'd been holding fall to the bed. What did you say? Her daughter crossed her arms, her voice harsh with bitterness. He's been seeing someone I've known. We've both known. Vivienne's mind reeled as the words sank in. Her son, quiet and steady like his father, confirmed it later that night. I didn't want to hurt you, Mom, he admitted softly. But Dad, he's not who you think he is. The betrayal was staggering, not just from Robert, but from the silence of her children, their secret carried like a burden too heavy for them to bear. She felt blindsided, as though the walls of her reality had crumbled in an instant. Vivienne didn't sleep that night. When Robert came home late, the smell of whiskey clinging to him, she stood in the living room waiting. Her hands were shaking, her voice unsteady, but her resolve was firm. Who is she? Robert stopped mid-step, his face darkening. What are you talking about? Vivienne clenched her fists. Don't lie to me, Robert. I know about the affair. They know about the affair. For a moment, his face flickered with something like guilt. Then it hardened into indifference. Fine, yes, I've been seeing someone. His voice was cold, almost careless. Are you happy now? Happy? The word stung like a slap. Vivienne's knees felt weak as she sank onto the couch. The man standing before her, this stranger in her home, was not the man she had married. How long? She managed to ask. Does it matter? He replied, shrugging. We haven't been a real couple for years, Vivienne. His words were a dagger to her heart. Vivienne knew she couldn't stay. The house that had once been their home felt foreign, haunted by betrayal and resentment. She packed a suitcase the next morning while Robert slept off the previous night's drink. Her son found her in the hallway as she zipped up her bag. Where are you going, Mum? He asked quietly, his eyes full of worry. I need some time, darling, she replied, her voice breaking. I'll be back soon. Her daughter refused to speak to her, the anger in her eyes clear. You're just going to leave him, she spat. What kind of mother does that? Vivienne didn't have an answer. She didn't know what kind of mother she was, or what kind of wife she had been, but she knew she couldn't stay. She left the house that day with no plan, just a suitcase and the ache of failure pressing against her chest. The streets outside felt strangely quiet, the world oblivious to the storm raging within her. She drove aimlessly, tears blurring her vision, until she found herself parked outside an old friend's house. Vivienne, her friend asked, alarmed as she opened the door. Vivienne's voice cracked. Can I stay for a while? Her friend didn't ask questions, simply pulled her into an embrace. It was the first kindness Vivienne had felt in months, and it undid her. She sobbed into her friend's shoulder, letting out the grief, the anger, and the shame she had kept locked inside. For the first time in years, Vivienne allowed herself to break. Vivienne spent the first few days at her friend's house in a fog of exhaustion. She could barely eat or sleep, her mind endlessly replaying Robert's words, the affair, and the betrayal her children had carried silently. She felt like she had lost everything in a single blow: her husband, her home, her sense of self. Her friend Claire was a source of calm amidst the chaos. Claire didn't pry, didn't demand answers. Instead, she offered cups of tea, warm blankets, and quiet understanding. You don't have to figure everything out right now, Claire told her one evening. Give yourself time to breathe. But time felt like the enemy. Every hour away from home was an hour Vivienne's mind filled with questions. Was leaving the right choice? What were the children thinking? Would Robert fight for their marriage, or was this the end? The calls came later that week. Her son, calm as always, asked when she was coming home. We need you here, Mum, he said softly. It doesn't feel right without you. Her daughter was less forgiving. How could you just leave? She shouted when Vivienne picked up. You always told us to hold this family together, and now you're the one running away? Vivienne felt her heart splinter at her daughter's anger. I didn't want this, she whispered, but I couldn't stay. You'll understand one day. Don't count on it, her daughter snapped before hanging up. Vivienne sobbed into her hands. She had hoped her children would understand, that they would see how broken things had become, but they were hurt, confused, and angry. And the worst part was, she couldn't blame them. A week after leaving, Vivienne finally spoke to Robert. He called late at night, his voice cold and clipped. "Are you coming back, or are you done with this family?" Vivienne's stomach churned. "Don't twist this, Robert." "You pushed me to this point," Robert laughed bitterly. "You're overreacting. So what if I made mistakes? Everyone does. You can't just walk away from everything we built." "Everything we built?" Vivienne's voice trembled with anger. "You tore it down, you lied to me. You lied to them." He went silent for a moment before speaking again. "Fine, stay gone if you want, but don't blame me when everything falls apart." The line went dead, leaving Vivienne staring at her phone, her chest heavy. Robert's words rang in her head. Was she to blame? Had she failed their family? Vivienne couldn't ignore her children's pain any longer. A week after leaving, she packed her things and returned to the family home. Robert was sitting in his study when she walked in. He looked up briefly, his face unreadable. "You're back," he muttered, then returned to his work, as though she'd been gone for an hour rather than days. The house felt different, colder, emptier. Vivienne spent that night in the guest room, surrounded by boxes of forgotten belongings and childhood mementos. Her son knocked quietly on the door before bed. "I'm glad you're back, Mum," he said, his voice soft. Vivienne forced a smile. "Me too, darling." Her daughter was less welcoming. She ignored Vivienne, retreating to her room with a scowl. The silence between them was heavier than words. Vivienne tried to make things feel normal again. She cooked meals, asked about their day, and tidied rooms no one noticed. But the truth lingered in every corner of the house. She couldn't unsee the evidence of Robert's betrayal, and worse, she couldn't unfeel the betrayal of her own heart. It happened one evening as Vivienne folded laundry. She found a crumpled receipt tucked into the pocket of Robert's trousers, a hotel reservation. Her chest tightened as she stared at the date. He had been with her again. The confrontation that night was inevitable. Vivienne stood in the doorway of his study, holding the receipt like a blade. "Is this how little we mean to you?" Her voice cracked. Robert barely looked up. "What do you want me to say, Vivienne?" "You knew this wasn't working." Her hands trembled. "Then why did you let me come back? Why are you pretending everything's fine?" "Because you wanted it," he snapped. "You wanted to play house, to pretend this mess can be fixed. But it can't." The room spun. Vivienne realized in that moment that Robert wasn't sorry. He had never been sorry. "You're right," she said softly, her voice steadying. "It can't be fixed." She turned and walked away, leaving him in the study, a man who no longer held her future in his hands. That night, Vivienne sat in the darkness of the guest room, listening to the silence of the house. Her decision had been made. She couldn't stay any longer, not for Robert, not for appearances, and not even for the children. She knew leaving again would be harder this time. Her daughter might never forgive her. The neighbors would talk, people would blame her. But Vivienne also knew that staying would destroy her. She spent the next day quietly gathering her things. As she packed, her son found her again, his face calm but sad. "Are you leaving for good this time?" Vivienne nodded, tears pooling in her eyes. "I have to." He hugged her tightly, whispering, "I understand, Mum." Her daughter refused to speak to her, standing in the hallway with her arms crossed, tears streaming down her face. "You're abandoning us," she choked out. Vivienne tried to reach for her, but her daughter turned away. "I love you," Vivienne whispered, but the words fell on deaf ears. When she finally left the house, Vivienne didn't look back. The sound of the door closing behind her echoed in her mind for days to come. Vivienne drove for hours, the weight of her decision pressing down on her like a heavy cloak. The silence in the car was broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional sniffle as tears rolled down her face. She didn't have a destination in mind. She only knew she couldn't return to that house, not now, maybe not ever. Her friend Claire welcomed her back without hesitation, her home a refuge once again. "You're doing the right thing," Claire assured her as they sat at the kitchen table that evening. Vivienne stirred her tea absent-mindedly, staring into the cup as though it held answers. "Then why does it feel like I'm abandoning them?" Vivienne whispered. Claire reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You're not abandoning them. You're showing them it's okay to leave when something isn't right. That's courage, Vivienne, not failure." Vivienne nodded, though her heart still ached. It wasn't failure she feared the most, it was the unknown. The first few weeks were the hardest. Vivienne moved into a small rental apartment, a one-bedroom flat with peeling wallpaper and creaky floors. It was a far cry from the home she had built with Robert, but it was hers. The quiet was deafening at first. She woke up every morning expecting to hear her children's voices or Robert moving through the house. But there was only silence. The absence of their lives around her felt like a phantom limb, always there, always aching. Her days were filled with practicalities, unpacking boxes, job hunting, and trying to rebuild the pieces of herself that had been buried under years of neglect. At night, the loneliness crept in, and Vivienne cried into her pillow, wondering if she had made the wrong choice. But each morning she rose again. Her children didn't call, not first. Vivienne texted and called them daily, her messages short but full of love. Thinking of you, hope you're okay. Her son replied occasionally with a few words, I'm fine, Mum. Her daughter, however, remained silent. Vivienne felt her absence like a knife to the heart. She replayed their last conversation over and over in her mind, wishing she could go back, explain better, make her daughter understand. You have to give her time, Claire reminded her. She's angry now, but she'll come around. Vivienne hoped Claire was right. Finding a job wasn't easy, but Vivienne was determined. She dusted off her old resume, polished her skills, and eventually secured a position as an administrative assistant in a small legal firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave her a routine, a purpose. Her first day back in the working world felt surreal. She watched the clock anxiously, unused to being away from the responsibilities that had defined her life for so long. But by the end of the day, Vivienne felt a small spark of pride. I did it, she whispered to herself as she unlocked the door to her apartment that evening. The job became an anchor, a place where her mind could focus on tasks instead of wandering back to the past. Slowly, Vivienne began to find her footing again. It wasn't long before Robert began to reach out, but not with kindness. His messages were sharp, laced with blame. You've destroyed this family, Vivienne. The kids are furious with you. You've given up on us. Each message felt like a dagger. Vivienne knew Robert was deflecting, pushing his guilt onto her, but it still hurt. One evening, after a particularly cruel message, Claire found her sitting on the couch, phone in hand, tears streaming down her face. Stop letting him do this to you, Claire said firmly. You don't owe him your pain. Vivienne looked up, her voice trembling. How do I stop? He was my whole life. Claire knelt in front of her, meeting her eyes. He was, but he's not anymore. You get to decide who you are now. Those words stayed with Vivienne. Months passed, and Vivienne began to rebuild her life piece by piece. She learned to live on her own, to fill the quiet with things that brought her peace. She started walking in the mornings, finding solace in the rhythm of her footsteps and the stillness of dawn. She reconnected with old hobbies, painting, reading, and baking. For the first time in years, Vivienne realized she could do things simply because they made her happy. One afternoon, while tidying up her small apartment, Vivienne noticed something. She was smiling. It wasn't a big dramatic moment, just a quiet realization that she was healing. Vivienne's son visited her one evening, appearing at her door with a takeaway bag in hand. I thought you could use some company, he said softly, stepping inside. Vivienne felt tears sting her eyes as she hugged him tightly. They ate dinner together, talking about everything and nothing, his work, his plans for the future, her new job. As he was leaving, he turned to her, his expression serious. I get it now, Mom, he said. I understand why you left. You did what you had to do. Vivienne felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Thank you, she whispered. Vivienne's daughter was a different story. The silence continued for months until one evening she called. Her voice was sharp, full of anger. I still don't understand, Mum, she said. You left us, you left me. Vivienne swallowed hard. I never left you. I left the marriage that was destroying me. There was silence on the other end, then a bitter laugh. Maybe you could have tried harder. Vivienne's voice softened. I tried, darling. For years I tried, but sometimes staying hurts more than leaving. The call ended abruptly, but Vivienne held on to hope that it was a step, however small, toward understanding. The call from her daughter stayed with Vivienne for days. Each word replayed in her mind like an echo she couldn't silence. The guilt clawed at her heart, but alongside it was a quiet truth: she couldn't go back. One evening, she found herself sitting on her small balcony, staring at the fading light of dusk. Her phone sat beside her, Robert's messages still unread. She took a deep breath and opened the last one. "You'll always be the one who broke us, Vivienne. The kids will never forgive you. You've lost everything." For a moment, tears threatened, but this time Vivienne pushed them back. She thought of the years she had stayed, shrinking herself for the sake of peace. The years she had hoped Robert would notice her, that he would change. "You don't get to define me anymore," she whispered into the quiet evening. Vivienne blocked his number. With Robert's voice finally silenced, Vivienne began to focus on herself with renewed determination. Her days developed a rhythm: work in the mornings, long walks in the afternoons, and quiet evenings spent with books and music. She discovered small joys she had forgotten: the smell of fresh-baked bread, the thrill of finishing a novel, the warmth of the sun on her face. Claire encouraged her to try new things, and Vivienne reluctantly agreed to join a local art class. She hadn't painted in years, but with a brush in her hand, she felt a spark she thought she had lost. Her first painting was a landscape, soft and gentle, full of rolling hills and bright skies. "It's beautiful," Claire said, smiling as Vivienne wiped paint from her hands. "I forgot how much I loved this," Vivienne admitted, her voice soft. "Then don't stop," Claire replied. One evening, as Vivienne returned home from work, she found her daughter waiting by her front door. The sight startled her. Her daughter stood with her arms crossed, her face unreadable. "Can I come in?" she asked. Vivienne nodded, her heart pounding. She made tea as her daughter sat stiffly at the kitchen table, staring at the small apartment. Finally she spoke. "Why didn't you tell me how bad it was?" Vivienne paused, holding the teapot mid-pour. "I didn't want you to carry that weight." Her daughter shook her head. "We carried it anyway, Mum." "Dad, he's not the man I thought he was." Vivienne set the teapot down, her voice gentle. "I tried to protect you. Maybe I didn't do it perfectly, but I did best I could." There was a long silence before her daughter whispered, "I'm sorry I was so angry." Tears welled in Vivienne's eyes as she reached across the table, taking her daughter's hand. "You don't need to be sorry, love. You've been through so much too." That night, they talked for hours about the past, the pain, and the possibility of healing. It was a beginning, fragile but real. After her daughter's visit, things began to shift. Her son stopped by more often, bringing stories of work and friendships. Her daughter started calling every now and then, their conversations awkward at first, but growing warmer with time. Vivienne realized that healing wasn't about fixing everything at once. It was about small steps: a phone call, a conversation, a visit that slowly pieced things back together. Vivienne's art class held a small exhibition at the local community center. She hesitated at first, embarrassed to show her work, but Claire pushed her to participate. "You've come so far, Vivienne. Show people what you've created." On the day of the exhibition, Vivienne's children surprised her by showing up. Her daughter stood in front of a painting of rolling hills, the first one Vivienne had painted, her eyes soft with emotion. "You painted this?" she asked. Vivienne smiled, pride warming her chest. "I did," her daughter nodded, glancing at her. "It's beautiful, Mum." In that moment, Vivienne felt something shift, a quiet victory, not over Robert or the past, but over the doubts that had haunted her for so long. Years later, Vivienne sat in her small garden, sipping tea as the sun rose. The world was calm, the quiet no longer heavy but peaceful. Her children visited often now, her son with his quiet strength, her daughter with her sharp humor, and they laughed together in ways she had once feared they never would. Robert was a distant memory, someone Vivienne no longer allowed to hold space in her mind. The anger and bitterness had faded, replaced by acceptance. Vivienne had built a life of her own. It wasn't grand or glamorous, but it was hers, full of small joys and quiet strength. She had learned to live for herself, to find peace in her own company, and to love the woman she had become. As she watched the light spill over the garden, Vivienne smiled. It hadn't been an easy road. There were moments of despair, days of doubt, and tears that still came when she remembered what had been lost. But in the end, Vivienne realized that leaving had not been the end of her story. It had been the beginning. We've come to the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you.